everyone, I'm Dr. Sam Baars. I'm Director of Research at the Centre for Education and Youth. I think the very first point that I'd want to really emphasise is that in all of this, I don't see whiteness as a marker of disadvantage. Also, I think while there is fairly compelling evidence at certain stages in the education system, we focus quite a lot today on what happens when kids get to 16. You can see in the data that there is a case for looking at the group of pupils that we're talking about today. But I think it's important to recognise that at other stages in the education system, actually, that's less compelling. At A level, some of these gaps are actually flipped on their heads. And some of the gaps that we see, for instance, in admission to higher education aren't then represented in terms of the outcomes that students get at the end of higher education and later in the labour market. So I know it's something that we all know, but I just think it's really important to emphasise that point. In terms of why, so Robert, the question that you posed, why do we see these gaps? Why this group? What might be going on here? If I had to pick one explanation, I would probably pick up the baton from what Mary was just saying about an area-based focus. So my own research and other research has shown that there are some really interesting and very stark area-based inequalities in a lot of this stuff. School quality, educational outcomes, and aspirations as well. I've never been a champion of the discourse about low aspirations. I don't think that's a very helpful discourse, and I think actually public discourse around low aspirations needs to catch up with the research base. But that doesn't mean there aren't differences in the types of aspirations that young people have. And research, some of the more interesting research in this area shows that essentially kids growing up in inner urban areas of deprivation can be up to 5 times as likely to aspire to highly skilled jobs as kids growing up in equally deprived outer urban areas, and that's controlling for ethnicity. So I think there's something going on there about, it's not whiteness itself that's disadvantaging young people, but it might be the types of area in which we tend to find more white kids growing up. And that then leads to explanations for me about the idea of opportunity structures, which we've been talking about a lot already, which is great to hear, and I would be keen to talk about more if we have time. I just wanted to really briefly come back on my earlier point about area-based disparities in the types of aspirations that young people have. My point was that some of that analysis actually controls for ethnicity. So whether you're white British or not, so growing up in an area that is outer urban does appear to have an impact on the types of aspirations that you have. So there seems to be like kind of a depressing effect on aspirations, if you like, regardless of the ethnic background of the kids that you're talking about. So I think that's pretty important to clarify. These sorts of debates do prompt us to interrogate the idea of like the capacity of the system to accommodate everyone. And I think on an academic note, just as Becky said, it really is that question of when it comes to social mobility, are we interested in absolute or relative social mobility? And relative social mobility encourages to say, well, there might be more people from this background or this gender entering these areas of the labour market or achieving this well at school, but has their increased capacity to get to those places, has that kind of acceleration been greater or less than the acceleration of other groups at the same time? That's the question of relativity that's, I think, arguably kind of more meaningful. I actually think adult education is crucial, and in some ways that's kind of almost pre-early, is I think the self-efficacy that parents feel about their ability to learn as adults has a really infectious consequence for kids. And on the gender of teachers, I don't think there's much weight either that has an impact on boys in primary schools. But something I've noticed when I go in to read with kids at my daughter's primary school, you don't see that many dads volunteering in some schools, and I think that might be an interesting aspect of the gender equation, so to speak. In terms of definitions of working class in the 21st century, that's a great question. Lots of books written on that one. I think the previous panel suggested that looking at income could be a potentially more useful indicator of educational disadvantage than free school meals. My sense is that the available data suggests that's not the case. Actually, there is a real cliff edge, as we know, in terms of FSM eligibility, in terms of how pupils do at school, that's not really present if you look at a more kind of gradated scale of income. It's surprisingly flat in terms of how kids do from families with different levels of income. There are sort of, there is a gradient, but it's actually relatively flat. So I think free school meals as a policy tool to divert resources and attention is still useful, but academic research has shown that you can wrap free school meals in with wider measures of socioeconomic status. So Steve Strand has, for instance, is just one academic who's done this to show that some of the things we're talking about, differences in groups, are present. They're there when you look at free school meals versus non-free school meals, but they're also, in some ways, they get even stronger if you then look at wider measures of socioeconomic status, which comes down to parental education and the jobs that parents do. I think we do go wrong when we see free school meals as a marker of class. I actually think there's a real mismatch between the two. There's some overlap at the edges, but really they are quite distinct things. I'd say free school meals is a really useful policy tool, but if we want to start looking at the mechanisms and some of the explanations that might be class-based, then we should talk about class and all the things that class means. I don't think it's politically correct to look at some of the disadvantages that other non-white groups face too, and presumably that's precisely why the committee is looking at the attainment of those groups. I think, yeah, teacher expectations are a factor. We did some work with the Greater London Authority a couple of years ago, which showed that instead of that report was looking at white free school meals and all Black Caribbean boys in the capital. And we did find evidence that teacher expectations can be a negative influence for the outcomes of both of those groups of boys. In terms of change, I think something that's alarming for me in terms of, and it's easier to be alarmist than it is to be positive, I know, but I think it's that thing of there's been progress, but it's way too slow. And I think the issue there is that people can therefore point to progress and say that, well, we're making progress and that's always good, right? But if it's way too slow, I think the Sutton Trust showed that at this rate, the attainment gap will be closed in around a century's time, which is probably a little longer than we would want to wait. Also, the IFS have done research recently showing that actually the link between school funding and the deprivation of schools is beginning to be decoupled slightly by new funding settlements. And I think that's potentially an issue for the future. Just like responding to COVID, there's latency in the system. And I think if we start making changes to the funding system that disadvantage the schools that need funding the most, then in 10 years' time, we're more likely rather than less likely to be back here discussing this again. Yeah, I think if I had to identify one area of the wider support that supports young people's attainment at school, but actually far more importantly than that, their broader well-being and functioning as human beings, is the decline of CAMHS and the strain that child and adolescent mental health services are facing at the moment. I think that's precisely the kind of wider systemic factor, which then places more strain on schools. So I think that's something really important. Potentially even more so than youth services. And the other, yes, in terms of SEND, I think it's really good that in the previous panel, we flagged this idea of the forgotten third. So the roughly third of pupils who finish secondary school without a decent pass in English and maths. Around 70% of young people with SEND are in that group, as opposed to about 29% of pupils without SEND. So there's clearly something going on in the system, which means that we're not serving young people who have special educational needs disabilities sufficiently. Yeah, I think a really key narrative that we need to move beyond to make progress in this area is this idea of needing to move out in order to move on. I think it's absolutely right that for so many young people, as you get older, that it's a chance to kind of, fly the nest and see other parts of the world. But actually, lots of young people, the research I've done, white working class areas shows that you often find young people who are very locally rooted, strong attachments to family, strong attachments to place. And I think we somewhat ride roughshod over that when we have a system or society where you have to move out of certain areas in order to get on. Now, that's not an easy nut to crack, but I think there's a clear role for local authorities in creating thriving places where not only young people might actually consider sticking around because there's a range of opportunities, but also you may also see young teachers, for instance, wanting to go and live in those areas because for all that London has going for it, it's got really, really expensive housing, and we've shown at the Centre for Education and Youth that's actually a real problem. So there's something going for lots of these areas where we an asset-based approach. I think this can be solved. It's just to reiterate the point I made earlier about, I think, adult education being crucial in this. We know from research that parental self-efficacy, not just parental education level, but actually parents' beliefs that they can kind of shape the world around them, including how their kids are getting on at school, is a really important factor. And I think adults continuing that belief that they can learn is really, really crucial. So actually, part of the solution is to focus on the adults, not the kids.